Let's look at the topic of sustainable diet, healthful eating for our bodies and our planet, or what I like to call green nutrition. This topic will ultimately emphasize the personal actions that you as students can take to try to obtain a sustainable diet. We will get you to go over some of your food choices and perhaps things that are happening around campus that may be contributing to or taking away from the possibility of having a sustainable diet. But the question is, what is a sustainable diet? It's kind of impossible to find any one definition out there, but we're going to look at a couple. And then we'll talk about food systems, food production systems. We'll look at something called the level of organization within a food system to kind of give you a sense of how everything really is built on a hierarchy. And when there is an impact in one level of this system of organization, it can have an effect on everything above it and below it. Apply that to organic food production. And we'll look at sustainable food systems. Actually, first we'll look at probably what I should call unsustainable food system, but then move on and ultimately review what you guys are going to do to get involved. So let's do some definitions first. An ecosystem is a community of living organisms and their interrelated physical and chemical environment. Let's say that ecology is the interrelationship of living organisms and their physical and chemical environment. Basically, you and everything around you. What's the environment? It's the total of the surroundings influencing each living being's existence, including physical, biological, and many, many other factors. The surroundings of a plant or an animal, for example, include the other plants in the area or other animals in the area, the climate, the location. All these things are part of the environment. A plant-based diet is one that is made up primarily, or for some folks entirely, of plant foods. Now, this doesn't necessarily exclude animal products or mean that you have to give up your hamburger. The idea is that you are replacing animal-based foods with plant-based foods when feasible. And I think the operative word here is feasible. It could be financially feasible. It could be geographically feasible. Meatless Mondays is maybe feasible. Sustainability refers to meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. A sustainable diet includes food choices that maximize personal health while minimizing the impact on the environment. A sustainable food system is one that provides healthy foods to meet food needs and nutritional needs while maintaining a healthy ecosystem that can also provide foods not just for us now, but for generations to come with minimal negative impact on the environment. It also encourages local production and distribution infrastructures and makes nutritious food available, accessible, and affordable to all. Furthermore, it's humane, it's just, and it protects farmers and other workers, consumers, and communities. Wow. From the media to the political front, issues like climate change, population growth, global warming, biofuels, and sustainable agriculture are headlines that make food more than just something we eat. We as consumers are bombarded with headlines and messages like these, and they're meant to inform and educate us and motivate us to make changes. Unfortunately, these headlines are often unbalanced and don't depict the whole picture. And sometimes they are agenda-driven. When you see headlines like these, you have to bring those critical thinking skills into play. Sustainability is a term that initially surfaced during the 1980s when there were international discussions about how environmental issues were impacting our global economy. Nations recognized that growth of their economies depended on innovations that would save the environment for the present as well as future generations. Today, sustainability is seen as an emerging concept, but there really is no universally accepted definition. So, I'm going to give you some. Sustainability is an emerging concept, maintaining something indefinitely into the future. Consequently, to be sustainable, we have to anticipate and successfully adapt to the changes ahead. Sustainability is a process. not a prescription. This process requires social, ecological, and economic dimensions. There is therefore no simple definition. It's a journey we embark on together, not a formula we agree to. The late Robert Rodale, perhaps you've heard of Rodale Press, he believed that sustainability is a question rather than an answer, and he had a 3-question test to apply to sustainable practices. Those questions were, is it economically feasible? Is it environmentally sound? And is it socially responsible? Now we have some definitions out of the way. Let's look at food systems. It's important to understand food systems because they dictate energy and nutrient cycling, and thus what's called the sustenance of life. In addition, your impact on the environment can result from consumer choices you make. So this is what can be called an energy pyramid. The sun emits energy, some of which reaches the earth to support life. Actually, a really small amount of the sunlight that's emitted reaches the earth. And energy flows through the ecosystem from producers to primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. So at the base of the pyramid, we have producers. They produce products that consumers will eat. So them that eats producers are called consumers. Let's say, for example, herbivores like cows will eat plants, and crustaceans like crabs will eat algae. As we move our way up this pyramid, we have secondary consumers as the ones that eat primary consumers, and tertiary consumers that consume all the other carnivores. So I ask you to take a moment to think about, where do you fall in this energy pyramid? We will also in class look at how energy is lost as you move up the pyramid, so that the energy required to maintain a tertiary consumer is much greater than the primary consumer. Perhaps you've heard of the phrase eat low on the food chain. We'll talk about how that saves energy. Your book describes this particular diagram as follows. The food system can be manipulated so that food is mass-produced and readily available for modern-day persons living in an industrialized society. The consumer promotes massively produced, ready-to-eat food, which drives the food production system. Let's look at some of the basics of this food production system. It starts with farming, gardening, fisheries. All foods, both plant and animals, are produced on some type of farm. And then after it's harvested, the food either goes directly to market or it is processed, packaged, and then marketed. That food that is processed is then shipped to warehouses and from there to local markets where it is sold to the consumer. Quote, the demand for more processed, ready-to-eat food has occurred with a growing population and with busier lifestyles. This system requires excessive natural resources. This constant demand for more and more foods, or I guess, that you can pop in your microwave, is taking its toll. This is the level of organization chart I referred to earlier. On the right are the levels of organization within a food production system. If there is a drought, then the animal is unable to survive, the food is unable to be grown, and it can have impacts above and below on this food production system. This concept is seen most clearly when we compare organic food production and conventional food production. Conventional plant practices commonly use pesticides, nitrogen fertilizers, sewage sludge, genetically modified organisms, and radiation. Conventional animal practices commonly use hormones, antibiotics, conventionally produced feed, manure might be applied to the land. Organic food producers use renewable resources and conserve soil and water to enhance the environment for the future. The nitrogen in the soil is maintained by composting and the action of decomposers. Animals are considered to be less confined than in conventional animal practices. So for a food to have this USDA organic label on it, it means that the government has inspected and certified the farm as organic. The above conventional aspects are prohibited. But the question that I'd like you to think about is organic food production sustainable? Even though organic production does restrict the use of pesticides and herbicides and synthetic fertilizers, it may not necessarily be sustainable. Think about it. The majority of organic production in the U.S. is large scale, and they have similar transportation miles required for distribution. Soil and water conservation practices may in fact be no better than conventional practices. It may make more sense to consider buying locally and getting your local food products than making sure that you have that organic apple from California on your table in December in Massachusetts. This is the nitrogen cycle. And there's a delicate balance that has to be maintained ecologically when we look at the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen exists in many different forms, and if it's out of balance, for example, when nitrogen is added in fertilizers, it can leach out of soil into water sources. And excess nitrogen in the soil from these fertilizers can then be unhealthy for humans and harmful to the environment. Also, these nitrogen products are produced through a petroleum-based process and are thus, while adding nitrogen to the soil, are depleting our fossil fuels. Whereas organic food production relies on the natural processes of what are called ammonification and nitrification. So organic food production actually supports the nitrogen cycle. How do you think your life and food choices affect the nitrogen cycle? These next two slides focus a little bit more closely on the food system and how we can sustain it. Actually, this slide I think is probably call it food system unsustainability. For example, we eat lots of fast foods and processed foods, and these are not made using sustainable methods. They're made with chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and so the crops that are made are not sustainable. The food and beverages that are made and processed and packaged and transported contribute to the depletion of fossil fuels. Our consumption of more conventionally produced foods, as well as processed, fast, and restaurant foods in general, contributes to an unsustainable food system and a global burden. And while I haven't talked about seafood in this presentation, the current techniques used to harvest seafood and fish farming methods generally damage the environment and the ecosystem. So I guess this would be a food unsustainable system slide. Changes begin with knowledge. Learn to choose foods that are produced in a sustainable way. Here are some suggestions that I'd like you to contemplate. Buying your food from local and regional suppliers, from a local food market down the street. Buy more whole and seasonal foods with less processed and fast foods. Try a diet that's plant-based and augmented with animal foods that have been produced in a sustainable way. These are some suggestions that can help us create and maintain a sustainable food system. As I said earlier, sustainability is a process, not a prescription. Energy flows through the ecosystem from producers up through tertiary consumers. The demand for processed food has increased with our growing population and busy lifestyle, putting excessive demands on our natural resources. Consumers should make choices to support a sustainable food system. What we're going to do in class, in addition to discussing some of the concepts that were mentioned earlier, is also work on that first class activity, thinking about a sustainable diet. And we will work our way through these different assignments, culminating with a collage or poster. Thanks.